former Senior Chief Petty Officer Garrett Shaw stood on the weathered wooden deck of his 32-foot camping trailer, surveying 20 acres of overgrown Georgia wilderness that he'd purchased 6 months ago for $38,000. Everything he could afford after his medical retirement from the Navy SEALs following a parachute accident during training operations. At 45 years old, with 23 years of service ended by a catastrophic equipment malfunction that left him with chronic pain and severely limited mobility in his left shoulder, Garrett had learned that rebuilding life after the teams required accepting compromises he'd never imagined making during his operational years. The property was a foreclosure that had languished on the market for 18 months before Garrett discovered it. Cheap because the land was completely undeveloped, the original farmhouse had collapsed into structural ruin decades ago, and 3 previous buyers had abandoned renovation attempts after discovering the overwhelming extent of damage and the prohibitive costs of clearing decades of neglect. Local contractors who'd evaluated the property had provided estimates ranging from $85,000 to $120,000 for basic restoration work, costs that transformed the apparent bargain into financial impossibility for anyone living on fixed disability income. But Garrett's plan was methodical and realistic. Clear the land gradually over months or years, renovate slowly using his VA disability payments of approximately $2,000 monthly, combined with construction skills learned during rural operations training across multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, and build a quiet, isolated life away from urban noise and crowds that triggered his PTSD symptoms with debilitating intensity. Research had shown that rural residents could be protective for veterans with PTSD, providing isolation that reduced triggering stimuli, allowing recovery at individual pace without the overwhelming sensory input characteristic of urban environments. Garrett had chosen this property specifically for that protective isolation. He lived in the camping trailer, positioned on the highest elevation point of his property, providing tactical sightlines across the entire acreage. Old habits from 2 decades of operational planning that remained embedded in his decision-making, even in civilian contexts where threat assessment was theoretically unnecessary. His only companion was Titan, a 10-year-old Belgian Malinois who'd been Garrett's K9 partner for 4 deployments spanning Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified operations in locations Garrett still couldn't discuss without violating security clearances that remained active even in retirement. Titan had been medically retired with significant hearing loss from blast exposure during a compound breach operation and progressive arthritis in his hips and rear legs that created visible stiffness and pain when rising from rest. Belgian Malinois were considered elite among military working dogs, smaller, lighter, and more agile than German shepherds, possessing exceptional intelligence, incredible work drive, and athletic capabilities that made them overwhelmingly preferred for special operations. Titan had qualified in the top 5% of his training class at Lackland Air Force Base and had executed detection operations that saved lives dozens of times during combat deployment. Despite his age, hearing loss, and chronic arthritis, Titan still moved with focused intensity when his tactical instincts activated. The muscle memory and deeply ingrained neurological patterns from years of operational conditioning didn't fade simply because military paperwork declared him medically discharged and unsuitable for continued service. The property had one dominant and immediately noticeable feature that local contractors had warned Garrett about repeatedly during his initial property inspections. A massive termite mound located approximately 50 yards behind where the old farmhouse foundation remained as crumbling concrete testimony to past habitation. The mound was extraordinary in size, approximately 15 feet tall and 20 feet across at its widest base point, its outer surface hardened by decades of calcite deposits and environmental exposure that had transformed the biological structure into something resembling concrete. Local pest control companies had provided removal estimates ranging from $4,500 to $7,000, explaining that the mound's age, conservatively estimated at 6 to 7 decades old based on its massive size and structural complexity, meant it had developed extensive underground tunnel networks requiring specialized equipment, comprehensive chemical treatments, and professional expertise to eliminate completely without leaving viable termite colonies that would simply rebuild. Garrett decided to handle the removal himself using a combination of excavation tools purchased from agricultural supply stores, chemical termite treatments, and controlled demolition techniques adapted from his SEAL training in explosive breaching and structural assessment. The decision would save thousands of dollars he didn't have, and the physical labor provided therapeutic value that his VA counselor had recommended for managing PTSD symptoms through productive activity. On a humid October morning, when temperatures climbed toward 85 degrees by 9 o'clock, typical for Georgia's extended warm season, Garrett began the systematic demolition of the termite mound using a 10-pound sledgehammer and military-grade pickaxe purchased from a construction supply warehouse. The work proved brutally difficult from the first strike. The mound's outer shell was harder than reinforced concrete in many sections, its biological structure reinforced by thick layers of calcite that had formed over decades of exposure to Georgia's humid subtropical climate. Each swing of the sledgehammer sent jarring impact through Garrett's injured shoulder, creating waves of pain that his prescription medication only partially managed. But Garrett had learned during SEAL training and 2 decades of operational service that discomfort was temporary. Missions were completed through disciplined persistence, and quitting because something hurt wasn't an acceptable option. Titan watched from the shade of a massive oak tree approximately 20 feet away, typically disinterested in Garrett's construction and renovation projects. The Belgian Malinois spent most days conserving energy to manage chronic pain from arthritis, resting in comfortable positions that minimized stress on his damaged hips. But as Garrett broke through the hardened outer layer into the mound's interior chambers, exposing the complex tunnel networks and internal structure that termites had constructed over generations, Titan suddenly stood with body language Garrett recognized immediately from hundreds of operational scenarios across 4 combat deployments. Alert posture despite the arthritis that normally kept him moving cautiously and slowly. Ears forward in focused attention that excluded all environmental distractions. Intense concentration directed specifically at the exposed interior of the termite mound. Titan wasn't reacting to general environmental stimuli or random curiosity. This was targeted, purposeful alert behavior, indicating detection of something significant. Garrett knew this behavior pattern with absolute certainty, born from years of operational partnership. Titan was exhibiting the exact same alert sequence he'd used during detection operations, not explosives or weapons, but something his extensive training recognized as anomalous and requiring immediate handler investigation. The Belgian Malinois moved toward the broken section of the Termite Mound with focused purpose that completely overrode his physical limitations and chronic pain, and began pouring at debris with the persistent, deliberate pattern that meant target located, investigate immediately, mission critical find. Garrett set down the sledgehammer, his tactical instincts fully engaged despite civilian context, and followed Titan's unwavering focus. He cleared away more of the mound's fractured structure, removing chunks of hardened material and exposing deeper interior chambers. The dog's attention remained locked on something approximately 4 feet deep within the mound's interior structure, a section that would have been completely inaccessible without deliberately breaking through multiple layers of the hardened exterior shell. As Garrett removed debris following Titan's insistent alerts, carefully excavating the area the dog had identified, he discovered something that shouldn't exist according to everything he understood about termite mound biology and formation patterns: a metal container, approximately 2 feet long and 8 inches wide, heavily corroded by what appeared to be decades of environmental exposure, but still structurally intact, embedded deep within the termite mound's interior chambers. The container's presence violated basic biological principles and physical impossibility. Termite mounds grew from the ground surface upward, layer by layer, over decades as colonies expanded their protective structure around the underground nest. For something manufactured to be inside this mound, not at the base where it contacted Earth, but embedded within the interior chambers 4 feet above ground level, meant it had been deliberately placed there when the mound structure was significantly smaller, then gradually encased as the termites built additional layers year after year. Based on the mound's estimated age of 6 to 7 decades and the container's extreme corrosion level, showing extensive environmental degradation, Garrett calculated this container had been placed approximately 60 years ago. Someone had deliberately hidden this container inside a termite mound during its earlier developmental stages, betting that no one would ever break the biological structure open to discover what was concealed inside. The hiding strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and patience. Termite mounds in rural areas were typically avoided or worked around, rather than destroyed, due to professional removal costs. Previous property owners had left this mound completely untouched for decades. It represented the perfect long-term hiding place for something meant to remain concealed indefinitely, or until the hider was long dead. Garrett stood in the oppressive Georgia humidity, staring at physically impossible evidence while Titan maintained rigid alert posture beside the exposed container. The combat Belgian Malinois, who detected an anomaly that 6 decades of concealment had successfully protected from any discovery until this moment. Garrett extracted the corroded container with meticulous care, documenting everything with photographs on his phone before disturbing the scene further. Habits from sensitive site exploitation operations and evidence preservation protocols that had become automatic during 23 years of SEAL service spanning multiple combat deployments. The metal construction was military-grade storage design, intended for long-term preservation, with a rusted padlock that broke with minimal force when Garrett applied measured pressure using his pickaxe as a lever. Inside the container, protected from 6 decades of moisture penetration by waterproof sealing that had maintained integrity despite exterior corrosion, Garrett discovered a carefully organized collection of items that stopped his breathing and activated every intelligence analysis protocol he'd learned during advanced SEAL training. First item, military dog tags stamped with identification, reading Technical Sergeant William Cross, USAF, with service numbers and dates indicating active duty during the Vietnam War era, specifically 1960 through 1965, based on the stamped date ranges visible on the worn metal. Second, a leather-bound journal remarkably preserved by the waterproof sealing, filled with handwritten entries in blue ballpoint ink dated from January 1963 through October 1964. The handwriting was precise, methodical, suggesting someone accustomed to technical documentation and detailed record-keeping. Third, a thick stack of black and white photographs showing a young airman in his mid-20s at what appeared to be a classified military facility. Aircraft hangars, maintenance operations, uniformed personnel, all with the grainy photographic quality characteristic of 1960s film processing technology. Fourth, official documents bearing confidential classification stamps with visible markings from 1964 showing Department of Defense and United States Air Force official designations, logos, and authorization signatures. Fifth, a handwritten letter placed deliberately on top of all other contents, dated October 15th, 1964, written in the same precise handwriting as the journal entries. The letter read in full, "To whoever finds this container, if you're reading these words, I'm long gone and beyond consequences. What's in this box represents documented proof of what they did to us at this facility. 63 men died in that crash on October 2nd, 1964, because of faulty hydraulic system equipment that Maintenance Command knew was defective but ordered installed anyway. I have comprehensive evidence documenting the equipment failures, the falsified inspection reports, and the command pressure to approve aircraft as airworthy despite our repeated warnings. But if I come forward while I'm still serving, they'll destroy me through court-martial, destroy this evidence through classification, and the families will never know their loved ones didn't die because of pilot error like the official accident report claims. So I'm hiding it where no one will think to look, inside something biological that grows slowly over decades, in a place no one cares about on decommissioned military property. Maybe someone will find it when it doesn't matter anymore to my career or my family's security. Or maybe it'll help families finally know the truth that their sons and husbands didn't die because someone made a flying mistake. They died because commanders prioritized mission schedules over equipment safety. Technical Sergeant William Cross, United States Air Force. Garrett's hands shook as he opened the leather journal and began reading the meticulously documented entries. Billy Cross had been a senior maintenance technician at a classified Air Force facility in rural Georgia. This exact property before. The military decommissioned it and sold the land as surplus real estate decades later. The journal detailed systematic institutional cover-ups of critical equipment failures, deliberately falsified inspection reports that certified defective components as airworthy, and direct command pressure applied to maintenance crews to approve aircraft for flight operations despite documented safety concerns. The entries were extraordinarily detailed. Specific dates and times of maintenance inspections, equipment serial numbers for questionable components, verbatim quotes from conversations with superior officers applying pressure, documentation of threats made against maintenance personnel who raised safety concerns. Billy had created comprehensive evidence with the precision of someone who understood he was building a legal case that might be needed for future accountability proceedings. The final journal entries from early October 1964 described a catastrophic C-130 transport aircraft crash that killed 63 service members during a routine training mission, officially attributed to pilot error compounded by adverse weather conditions, but Billy's contemporaneous documentation showed it was mechanical failure from hydraulic system components that maintenance crews had repeatedly flagged as corroded and structurally compromised, but were ordered by facility commanders to approve for installation. The photographs provided powerful visual evidence supporting Billy's written documentation. Images of Billy Cross with other maintenance airmen, the facility's aircraft hangars and flight line operations, and, most critically for forensic analysis, detailed close-up photographs of defective equipment components with handwritten notes on the photograph backs identifying specific manufacturer serial numbers, installation dates, and documented failure points that maintenance had recorded but command had dismissed. The confidential documents were original maintenance logs showing repair histories, formal inspection reports with forged approval signatures, and internal command memoranda explicitly showing that facility commanders were aware of equipment safety problems and had made calculated decisions to order flight operations to continue anyway, prioritizing mission completion schedules over crew safety and maintenance recommendations. Garrett contacted the United States Air Force through official channels, submitting a comprehensive formal report to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations explaining his discovery in detail with supporting photographic documentation. The institutional response was dismissive and bureaucratically final. 60-year-old allegations from an unverified source discovered in a termite mound don't constitute actionable evidence under current investigative standards. Without independent authentication of the documents and corroboration of the claims through official records, we cannot justify reopening closed accident investigations from 1964. But Garrett's extensive intelligence training and operational experience recognizing patterns in complex data recognized what civilian investigators either didn't see or chose to ignore for institutional convenience. The equipment serial numbers Billy had meticulously documented could be cross-referenced with accident investigation records archived from the October 2nd, 1964 crash. If the defective hydraulic system parts Billy had identified and photographed matched components recovered from the crash site and documented in the original investigation, it would prove command negligence with forensic certainty that couldn't be dismissed. Garrett reached out to Dr. Rebecca Santos, a respected military historian specializing in Cold War-era Air Force operations, who'd published extensively about institutional accountability failures and military accident investigations. Dr. Santos examined the evidence during a visit to Garrett's Georgia property and immediately recognized its profound historical and legal significance. The October 1964 crash Billy Cross references was one of the deadliest non-combat Air Force incidents of that entire era, Dr. Santos explained, while carefully reviewing the journal with professional intensity and visible emotion. Officially, the accident was attributed to pilot error, compounded by adverse weather conditions during the training mission. But rumors of equipment problems and maintenance concerns circulated within Air Force maintenance communities for years afterward, though no one ever came forward with documentation. This evidence, if authenticated through forensic analysis and comparison with archived crash investigation records, could fundamentally reopen investigations and provide closure to families who've spent 60 years believing their loved ones died due to human error rather than institutional negligence and deliberate safety cover-ups. The critical turning point came when Dr. Santos contacted families of the 63 crash victims through military veteran organizations, Air Force heritage groups, and genealogical research identifying surviving relatives. Within 2 weeks of her initial outreach, 3 families responded, children and grandchildren of the service members who died, all carrying the same inherited burden, believing for 6 decades that their fathers and grandfathers had died because someone in the cockpit made a preventable flying mistake. When Garrett showed them Billy Cross's evidence through carefully scanned copies of the journal, photographs and documents, documenting comprehensively that the crash was preventable and that Command had knowingly approved operations with critically defective equipment, their decades-old grief transformed into something more powerful and actionable: organized demand for institutional accountability and historical truth. The families collectively petitioned the United States Air Force to reopen the 1964 crash investigation based on newly discovered evidence. The Air Force initially refused, citing statute of limitations for potential criminal prosecution and insufficient new information to justify expending substantial institutional resources on investigations of incidents from 6 decades ago. But Garrett did something that forced unavoidable institutional action. He contacted Marcus Webb, a veteran investigative journalist who'd spent 30 years investigating military cover-ups, institutional accountability failures, and suppressed evidence cases. Webb recognized the story's explosive significance immediately upon reviewing Billy Cross's documentation. The story went national within 72 hours of Webb's initial publication. Navy SEALs Belgian Malinois discovers 60-year Air Force cover-up hidden in Georgia Termite Mound. Major television networks picked up the story. Congressional offices received hundreds of constituent calls demanding investigation. Military affairs committees in both Senate and House initiated preliminary inquiries. The political and media pressure became untenable for the Air Force to continue dismissing. Media attention combined with congressional inquiries triggered by the family's increasingly sophisticated and coordinated advocacy efforts forced the Air Force to authorize an independent forensic review conducted by retired Air Force accident investigators with no institutional conflicts of interest or career stakes in the findings. The comprehensive forensic analysis confirmed everything with devastating precision. Billy Cross's journal entries, maintenance logs, and meticulously documented equipment serial numbers matched exactly with components recovered from the October 1964 crash site and documented in the original accident investigation archives. The defective hydraulic system parts Billy had identified, photographed, and warned about were verifiably installed in the C-130 transport aircraft that catastrophically failed during flight, killing all 63 personnel aboard. Facility command officers had knowingly and deliberately approved flight operations with equipment that maintenance crews had repeatedly documented as unsafe, prioritizing mission completion schedules and avoiding maintenance delays that would reflect poorly on facility performance metrics reviewed by higher headquarters. The United States Air Force issued a formal institutional acknowledgement 14 months after Garrett's discovery. The October 2, 1964 crash that killed 63 service members was caused by command negligence and systematic maintenance safety cover-ups, not pilot error or adverse weather conditions, as the original accident investigation had officially concluded. The accident report was formally amended, with updated findings reflecting accurate causation. The 63 service members who died were posthumously and officially exonerated of any responsibility for the accident. Their families received formal, written apologies from the Secretary of the Air Force and updated death certificates issued by the Department of Defense, reflecting accurate cause determinations that removed any implication of crew error or pilot mistake. Billy Cross, who had died in 1998 at age 58 without ever revealing what he knew, carrying the secret and crushing guilt for 34 years after hiding the evidence, was posthumously awarded the Air Force Commendation Medal for extraordinary integrity and moral courage in documenting institutional failures, despite significant personal and professional risk. His family, a daughter named Sarah Cross Martinez, 3 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren who'd never known their grandfather, was haunted by this devastating secret throughout his entire adult life. Contacted Garrett through Dr. Santos's coordination. Sarah explained her father's complicated final decades during an emotional meeting at Garrett's renovated Georgia property. "He carried that guilt every single day of his life," Sarah said through tears, but with steady voice, reflecting decades of processing grief she hadn't fully understood until now. "He would wake up screaming about the 63 men, though he never explained why to any of us. He told my mother once, years before he died, that he'd hidden evidence of something terrible but couldn't come forward without destroying our family's security. He'd lose his Air Force pension, face court-martial for violating security regulations, possibly serve prison time for mishandling classified materials. He died in 1998, believing no one would ever know the truth he'd documented. You gave him vindication and peace he couldn't give himself during his lifetime." The United States Air Force established the William Cross Whistleblower Protection Initiative, a comprehensive institutional program creating formal, protected channels for maintenance personnel, technical specialists, and all military members to report safety concerns, equipment failures, and command pressure to falsify documentation without fear of retaliation, career destruction, or legal consequences. The program was directly inspired by Billy Cross's case, formally acknowledging that institutional culture 60 years ago had been so hostile to safety reporting that his only viable option was hiding evidence in a termite mound and hoping someone would eventually discover it decades later. Garrett received no official financial reward from the Air Force, Department of Defense, or federal government, but something emerged that proved far more valuable to the families and to honoring Billy Cross's sacrifice. The families of the 63 crash victims collectively established a permanent memorial scholarship fund in Billy Cross's name, with Garrett named as the fund's administrator based on unanimous family vote recognizing his essential role in bringing suppressed truth to light after 6 decades. The initial contribution was $130,000 pooled from the family's combined resources, children and grandchildren contributing from inheritances, retirement savings, and organized fundraising efforts to honor their lost relatives by helping future military families affected by similar tragedies. The scholarship fund provided educational support to dependents and family members of military personnel who died in non-combat incidents, accidents, and training operations, specifically honoring the legacy of lives lost to preventable failures when institutions prioritized mission metrics over safety and accountability. 6 months after destroying the Termite Mound, Garrett completed major renovation of his property's main residential structure, using his VA disability payments, construction skills honed over decades, and focused determination characteristic of SEAL operational persistence. He established a permanent memorial on the exact spot where the massive Termite Mound had stood for 6 decades, concealing Billy Cross's evidence. A polished granite marker engraved with Billy Cross's name, the names of all 63 crash victims listed in formation by rank, and a simple inscription reading, "Hidden for 60 years, found by a Belgian Malinois who never stopped detecting what mattered." Truth doesn't decay. It just waits for warriors willing to dig. Dr. Rebecca Santos published a comprehensive historical book titled The Termite Mound Secret: How Institutional Cover-Up, One Technician's Conscience, and a Combat Dog Brought Truth to Light after 6 decades of silence. Garrett and Titan were featured prominently throughout. The medically retired SEAL renovating forgotten property, and the combat Belgian Malinois, whose finely tuned detection instincts had activated on something that scientifically shouldn't have existed within that mound's biological structure. The book became required reading at United States Air Force Academy, Air Force officer training schools, and Air Force maintenance technical training programs as a comprehensive case study in institutional integrity failures, the devastating consequences of prioritizing mission completion over equipment safety, and the critical importance of protecting whistleblowers who document safety failures at personal and professional risk. 1 year after the discovery, Garrett hosted a formal memorial ceremony at his renovated Georgia property. Families of the 63 crash victims attended, some traveling from across the United States, representing 3 generations who'd lived their entire lives with incomplete, inaccurate answers about how their relatives died in 1964. They planted a memorial oak tree precisely where the massive termite mound had stood for 60 years, gradually encasing Billy Cross's hidden evidence. Titan, now 11 years old and moving with visible slowness due to progressive arthritis, sat beside the newly planted tree with the same dignified professional bearing he'd maintained during operational service across 4 combat deployments. Children and grandchildren of the crash victims took turns approaching the Belgian Malinois, thanking the combat dog who'd found what 6 decades of official investigations, 3 property ownership changes, and institutional resistance had successfully concealed. A reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, covering the ceremony for an extensive feature story about institutional accountability and delayed justice, asked Garrett the question that captured everyone's curiosity. What made him destroy the termite mound instead of working around it the way 3 previous property owners had done for decades? Garrett's answer became the closing quote of Dr. Santos's book and was later inscribed on the memorial marker. "I was told by every contractor that professional removal would cost thousands of dollars I didn't have. I'm a disabled veteran living in a camping trailer with chronic pain and extremely limited resources. But I'm also a Navy SEAL, and SEALs don't quit on objectives because something's hard, expensive, or inconvenient. I started breaking down that mound because it was physically in my way and I needed to clear the land for construction." Titan found what was inside because he's a detection dog who doesn't retire from detecting just because we're not in a war zone anymore. We weren't deliberately looking for Billy Cross's evidence. We were just doing the work that was in front of us, one sledgehammer strike at a time. Sometimes that disciplined persistence is enough. The termite mound that had stood for 6 decades, growing layer by biological layer around a secret that would have remained buried forever without deliberate destruction, was demolished by a medically retired veteran who needed to clear land for practical property renovation, and a Belgian Malinois combat dog who couldn't ignore a detected anomaly his years of training identified as significant and mission-critical. Billy Cross's calculated 60-year gambit paid off not through official investigation channels, deathbed confession, or deliberate historical research, but through the unpredictable intersection of practical necessity, finely tuned detection instincts, and one combat K9's absolute refusal to walk past something that didn't belong in that mound's interior structure. Truth hidden in the most unlikely concealment location, embedded within a biological structure that grew incrementally for decades, finally found daylight and institutional accountability, because warriors don't stop being warriors when they leave military service and sign retirement paperwork. They just find different battles worth fighting, different missions worth completing, even in termite mounds on forgotten Georgia property where 63 deaths had been waiting 6 decades for someone to care enough to dig through hardened layers and expose what institutions had successfully buried.